Hi everyone, this is Dr. Catalana. I wanted to give you a brief overview of Bandora's social learning theory. Now this is just a short presentation because I really like the article that I uploaded for you to read, and I want you to make sure you go back and view that video on the Bobo doll experiment. If you had not seen that before, it's a really important experiment to know about. One thing just to reiterate, these topics related to behaviorism are almost always on teacher accreditation exams, so it really is important that you know this material, and also it will be super helpful as you focus more heavily on writing your learner support report. So just to recap a couple of things, and I'll go ahead and do this full screen for you here. To recap a couple of things here, we've talked about behaviorism for our first kind of content of the week, and that was when we first discussed classical and operant conditioning. So the whole thing with behaviorism is that we focus on how external events change our students' observable behaviors. So if I notice that the class is really loud, I turn off the light, that's an external event, and then I observe the students, hopefully get quiet and listen to the teacher. Very similarly, you can be at the doctor and external event, they clean your arm off with the alcohol swab, and your observable behavior is that you get a little bit nervous or you tense up. Same thing could be said about the classroom, right? So let's say that you are in a class that's graded really heavily on participation, and you could know that at any time your teacher could call on you, right? So that's going to provide probably some anticipation. Then they call on you and you don't know the answer. So your external event is being called on. Not knowing the answer makes you anxious, and that's observable. Okay? So behaviorism is all about conditioning kids. So here's your just quick overview, classical versus operant. Remember, classical conditioning here is about involuntary responses. That's your key difference between classical and operant. So involuntary response is most commonly a fear response. And I mentioned in my previous presentation, you really want to watch out for fear responses in your children. So the name to remember for classical conditioning is Pavlov, Pavlov's dog, the famous experiment being that he started salivating at the sound of the bell because the bell and the food had been paired. Okay, so classical conditioning, all involuntary. Operant conditioning is voluntary responses. So the example of me turning off the lights as the teacher and the students being quiet, that's a voluntary response. You can choose to be quiet. You can't choose to be fearful or not. Okay, so there's your difference. Again, your name to remember here is Skinner. And his famous experiment was that he trained the rat to be able to press the different lights in order to receive a treat as a reward. So that's just a brief overview. We've already talked about these two. What I really want to focus on, both of these involve the word conditioning, which basically means we can train the object, or train, in our case, the student, to do something. So I can train my students to respond behaviorally based on their external environment. So there's definitely truth in those theories, but as it stands with just classical and operant conditioning, we're not really considering like the mental state of the student. So we're kind of treating the student just the same as a dog or just the same as a rat, which should make you uncomfortable and is not okay. So that's where social learning comes in. So today we will talk through the Bobo doll experiment by Bandora. We'll talk about the social learning theory, particularly why it's important for students living in poverty. We'll look at the difference between observational and enactive learning, And finally, we'll look at different factors that affect observational learning. Hold on, there's a train coming by my place here. No, it wasn't too loud. Okay, so just brief overview. Again, I'm expecting that you have already read the assigned article and watched that video. Okay, so social learning theory is beyond behaviorism. The name you want to know here is Bandura. So Bandura is very famous. One thing I do typically tell my students to notice, a lot of the psychologists that we study look the same. Most of them are white men. There's nothing wrong with that, but you need to know that there are other people who have done equally important, if not more important, research. And that's just to show you, I want you to be aware of those inequities. They bother me, they should bother you. Usually when we have the ability to meet in class together, your final project, I actually assign you guys theorists that are kind of hidden figures that I think are so important to know. I'm not doing that this semester because I want you guys to do a final project in terms of final communication with your focus students, but I do want to point that out. So social learning theory, how can we look at our students not just as objects that can be trained, basically here. So you should have watched this video on the Bobo doll, so I won't go into major detail, but the takeaway from this experiment is that when children observed an adult who was acting aggressively toward the Bobo doll, when left alone, the children would then copy that action. So if the children observed an adult hitting the doll or throwing it on the ground, then the adult leaves. The child is very likely to do the exact same thing. Now, this has some obvious relationship to all children in that they are constantly watching, and we have to be careful what they're observing because it's not just observation and they're not changing because of it. Students are really going to react to what they observe. Something else I wish the video had been more clear on was that this had a greater impact in terms of if the child watched negative behavior and then copied it. It had a greater impact if that child was relatable or related even to the adult. So for example, if this little girl watched an older woman act aggressively, then she was more likely to act aggressively toward the doll than if she had watched an older man. And that will be important for a little bit later in this presentation. Okay, so Bandura obviously thought that students learn from observation. So we have two terms here, inactive learning and observational learning. Now, inactive learning is learning by doing and experiencing alongside someone else. So as you are in the field, you are all engaging in inactive learning, meaning that you are active alongside someone who is more experienced, being your host teacher. So many of our students, actually in my opinion, everyone, prefers to learn by inactive learning, meaning you don't want to just be sitting there. You want to be part of the experience. Observational learning is learning vicariously by simply watching each other. So inactive learning means you're doing something along with the individual that you're observing, and observational learning means you're just watching it. So actually before Bandura, people thought that watching violent behavior would actually reduce violence because they thought, oh, if I watch this violent behavior, I'll kind of like let out my violence. But actually the opposite was true. And the more violent behavior we watch, the more likely we are to model that behavior later. So for example, somewhere I've seen this very often in the classroom is watching students at play. So if you start really listening to what the students are pretending, what kind of scene is going on in the home center, what are the conversations that they're modeling, I have seen some disturbing play, and that is typically a really good signal that something disturbing is going on at home, because that child had to model the behavior from somewhere. So even the way that children play can actually tell us a lot about what they may be observing. Okay, so a couple factors that affect observational learning. And actually, I'm going to come out and show you guys this slide real quick. Okay, so these are a couple of pictures of potential role models. One of these is actually my role model, but I picked a couple because there are various individuals' potential role models here. My question to you, is there any role model right here for you? Chances are maybe, probably not like, oh gosh, yes, I really, really respect this person. Most likely this is no one's role model. But I want to talk through some important factors here. Okay, so we've got at the top, this is Paula Deen, right? So she is famous for cooking, but more importantly, she went through some pretty nasty lawsuits and does not have a good reputation right now, or at all, really. But I have had students in the past say, oh, I really look up to Paula Deen because of her cooking, and that was when I was teaching high school, and I had a few students who wanted to be cooks in the future, right? This guy right here is one of my role models, and this guy right here is probably my biggest role model. So chances are you're like, definitely not. I don't know who these two people are, right? So this dude right here, this is Paul Torrance. Paul Torrance is a famous researcher, and he just did a lot of really awesome research with kids and creativity, and how different students will kind of use creativity as a way to process their emotions. And he was really famous for working with low-income students who are low income. So I just really respect his work. Now, this right here is actually my dad, right? So my dad is also works in education. He is works at a medical school. So he used to be a doctor, a medical doctor, and now he works at a medical school. Now, the reason my dad was probably not one of your role models is because you didn't know who he was. You had no relationship to him. Most likely, the reason Paul Torrance was not one of your role models, because you probably don't know who he was, and you don't have any relationship to him. Okay, now here we have Miley Cyrus / Hannah Montana. I can remember so many times babysitting and growing up that all of my little kids loved Hannah Montana, right? They really wanted to be like her. Then we know that things changed for Miley Cyrus, and she was no longer a great role model, but there were certain children that still wanted to be like her. Okay, so the point of this slide is for you to think, well, why would this guy be my role model? And the short answer is he wouldn't. And that's because you don't know him. You can't relate to him. Whereas for me, of course he's one of my role models. This is my dad. I love him, and he has taught me so much. Same for my mom. I should have both of them up here. But they wouldn't be role models necessarily for you because you don't know them. Okay, so that brings us back to this slide here. Factors that impact observational learning. Now, first off, the developmental status of the child or the learner is definitely going to impact. Something I think that is more important for our purposes here is, who is the model? So number one, is this model of high prestige, meaning they're well known? And can the students see themselves in this model? So relatedness. The great example I just gave of, I see myself in my dad, so I can more easily relate to him. And this is so important in education because as we teach, we give examples. And if we don't give our examples that our students can relate to, they won't learn observationally. So, for example, if we read kids' books, children's literature, that only portrays white, middle income, higher income families, then students who don't look like that or don't live like that have trouble seeing themselves in those stories. So it's really important that we are providing models that the students can relate to. And lastly, can the student relate to the goals and expectations that the model is presenting? And by that, I mean, while you're watching the model's behavior, does it seem possible? Okay? I have never taken a gymnastics class in my entire life. I love watching it. I think it's super fun. Now, if I had the opportunity to go to the Olympics and watch the USA gymnastics team, it would be really cool, but I wouldn't learn anything observationally because I don't expect myself to be able to do what they're doing. Okay? So it is kind of desirable for me, but it doesn't seem possible. So when we talk about observational learning, the student has to have some kind of emotional connection to what the model is doing. But here, the most important thing is, can the student relate to the model? Too often in education, we are only demonstrating certain individuals, right? So we're looking at ed psych through the perspective of another train, I'm sorry, some white upper class men, right? And what's difficult with this, guys, is I have to teach certain material because I know it's going to be tested. So part of me wants to teach the Hidden Figures version of this class, and usually I do a merge. Again, given our situation, it's been hard for me to do. But I do want you to think about that. Society is saying we have to teach one thing, and when we teach those things, it's hard for certain students to learn observationally. Okay, so the last thing I want to end with here is the obvious relationship between this content and the media. So what our students are observing, whether what their parents are doing, their brothers and sisters are doing, or what they're watching on TV, they're not just passively observing. Actually, they are learning through that observation. And even right now, in the midst of this crisis our country is going through and the entire world is going through, think about how kids are spending their time and what they are seeing and what they are observing. And that is why these concepts are so important, and why, as educators, we have to very strategically use observational learning. So we can't just say, you can do anything you want to. We have to provide examples that the child can relate to, so they can learn from their role models, and they can inactively learn by working alongside others. Okay, so just to overview here, you should be able to explain Bandura's experiment with the Bobo doll. His theory is called social learning theory. Just think of that as social, meaning you're interacting with other individuals. And that's really important with students in poverty because we don't know what they're observing. Now, guys, we don't know what any child is observing, so that definitely expands to all children. Make sure you know the difference between observational and inactive learning, and you can discuss those 3 factors that impact observational learning. Okay, I hope you are all doing well, and I am always happy to answer any questions you may have.